Hello, everyone. This is Stephen with Democracy Demythologized, and today I'm talking with Dr. Terry Moe. Dr. Moe studies presidential power, something that's particularly relevant right now with what we're seeing with the current presidency. The current power grabs we're seeing under Donald Trump definitely seem unprecedented, but they're part of a longer history of Republican presidents, in particular, trying to take power and movement to try to solidify power in the president as kind of a all-powerful authoritarian dictatorship. And that's what Dr. Moe is talking about. He recently wrote a book about this called The Trajectory of Power and the Rise of the Strongman Presidency. And that's what we're talking about. So if you want to learn more about this aspect of US history, I would definitely recommend you check it out. Without further ado, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Terry Moe. How are you doing today?
Doing just fine. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm doing well. Yeah. So you're a scholar who's done a lot of analysis of politics. You recently came up with a book. Want to make sure I'm going to read the title just to make sure I say it right. Trajectory of Power: The Rise of the Strongman Presidency. Talking about a lot of the kind of the history of the presidency. Maybe let's get started with, before we talk about that in a little more detail, let's get started with what made you interested in studying politics, and maybe what made you interested in trying to understand like presidential power and bureaucracy and the things that you have studied within politics.
Well, for whatever weird reasons, I was interested in politics and the presidency when I was very little. I think maybe my dad was interested in politics. He used to talk to me about President Eisenhower and the elections coming up and all that stuff, and I was into it, right? So from the time I was a little boy, I would follow presidents, and I had a game of the presidents, where each president had a little medallion with his picture on it. And so I knew all the presidents, and I was into it in a big way. So I don't know, later on in life, when I went to college, I just never thought I could get a job, studying politics. So I wound up majoring in economics, which I really liked. But I decided in the end that for me, economics was too boring and too technical. And I shifted over to political science and went to graduate school in political science, got a PhD in that. And before long, I was studying the presidency and bureaucracy, which seemed very natural to me. It was what I was really interested in.
Yeah, there we go. I guess there's probably a lot of people that were fascinated by the president when they were a little kid. And I guess for you, it never faded. It just kind of became the thing that you did.
Yep. It's a lifelong thing.
Yeah. So I guess also being a lifelong thing, it's evolved over time. This is something you talk about in the book. Do you maybe want to give a little bit of an overview of how you've been in the book you analyze the presidency particularly from Ronald Reagan to now and presidential power? Do you want to kind of give a high level overview of what you talk about?
Sure. It's really much larger in scope than that. The scope that you've described is big, but this is even bigger.
Yes.
So really the starting point is that the United States is in the midst of a crisis of democracy. And what we try to do in this book is to provide readers with a big picture understanding of how this could have possibly happened in a country like the United States which has long been a beacon of democracy for the entire world. Why did it happen here, of all places? Anyone who tries to explain that, it'd be a natural thing to put the focus on Donald Trump, because he certainly seems to be the cause of this threat to democracy that we're currently under and experiencing. But the fact is, as we show in the book, that the problem goes well beyond Trump and is rooted in fundamental social and political forces in American society that have taken place over many decades. And above all, these developments radically transformed American conservatism and the Republican Party and caused them to become much more extreme, much more anti-system, much more populist, and led them to pursue a presidency of extraordinary power and ultimately a strongman presidency dedicated to taking on the system and ultimately taking it down. To understand why our democracy is now in crisis, it's important to put the focus on these underlying fundamentals and how they have shaped the historical trajectory of presidential power throughout American history, and how it is that they ultimately gave rise to the presidency of Donald Trump and to his strongman presidency. So really, to focus on Trump is to miss most of the story. Most of the story is in these underpinnings that drove what ultimately happened, and he was more a symptom than a cause of this crisis. So what we try to do in the book is to connect the dots. It's a complex set of things that have happened over time. We cover a vast expanse of American history, really going all the way back, to the founding, but focusing mainly on the 20th century and 21st century and on the modern history. And we try to make it understandable, to boil it down to these basic things that are responsible for the crisis we're currently in, and to provide an explanation that is accessible to a wide audience and very readable. And that I think readers will find works for them, and that they can come away thinking, wow, this seems complicated, but actually it's very understandable, and now we get it. If we've done our jobs, that's the way people should feel when they read it. So we hope, people will take a look at it, and that it will turn the light bulbs on.
Yeah, this makes total sense. So I guess what do you I agree with you that what's going on with Donald Trump is very much like it's not out of nowhere. It's very much the building of history over a long period of time. I guess, what do you see as some of the biggest threads leading to this kind of rise in power?
Okay. Well, you hear people talk about the administrative state, and the administrative state actually has a lot to do with it, which would be a surprise to some people. First of all, what is the administrative state? It often gets demonized, but it shouldn't be. The administrative state is really almost all of government, and it consists of all of the agencies and all of the programs that make up a government and that carry out the policies that are passed by the legislature and signed by the president. Right? So, unless you had an administrative state, unless you had all these agencies and programs and all the people that populate them, the career civil service, the appointees and experts, professionals, and so on, unless you have all that, the policies that are passed in the policymaking process don't mean a single thing because they're just words on paper. They need to get executed, carried out, implemented by the administrative state. So that's all the administrative state is, and all democracies have administrative states, right? People on the right demonize the administrative state, but the fact is we need an administrative state if we're going to be a democratic government that works. So, okay, that's a preface. Now, the administrative state in the United States first really emerged during the Progressive Era, which emerged in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And that was sort of the beginning of an active, positive government at the federal level, where government was actually trying to address the many social problems that people wanted to be addressed at the time. I mean, before that, government didn't do much of anything. But in the late 1800s, we had massive industrialization and immigration and urbanization. Society was being hugely transformed. And we had a Congress that was corrupt and was incapable of responding to these situations and doing anything about all the problems that resulted, from urbanization and all the rest, right? So, so we needed a government, the progressives thought, that could do something to help people. We needed to have regulation of drugs. We needed to have regulation of meat packing, because so much of the meat that was processed was contaminated. There were monopolies. There was price fixing. There was child labor. And uncompensated overtime. Workers were abused in a variety of ways, and on and on and on. And these were problems that were minimal or non-existent, 30, 40 years earlier. And so people were saying, we need a federal government that can actually do something about these problems, and that's the way people think today, It's like if something goes wrong, the government needs to do something about that. Somebody's going to get blamed. Okay, so back then, there was no government, really. There was no administrative state, almost nothing. The progressives began creating one. With agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Fed, and a number of other agencies, right? This was the beginning. And then soon thereafter came the Great Depression, where people were saying, hey, the government needs to do something, right? We're in a huge depression. Everybody's suffering. 25% of the people are out of work. The government needs to be taking an active role. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt did. That was Roosevelt's New Deal. And so that greatly boosted the administrative state and increased its size and scope. Now, conservatives, from the very beginning in the progressive era, hated the administrative state. They were opposed to big government, to high taxes, to high spending, and to regulation of business. What they wanted was the government of the past, the government that did very little, so they were opposed to the administrative state, and they conjured up images of socialism and totalitarianism and all that. But these conservatives were at the fringes of politics. Republicans were conservative, but they were sort of moderately conservative. There were also others in the Republican Party who weren't very conservative at all. The Jacob Javitzes of the world later on, Chuck Percy. And so the Republican Party was really not controlled by conservatives. The conservatives were at the margins of the Republican Party. And the Goldwater capture of the nomination in '64 was an unusual capture of power by the conservatives just for a while, right? It didn't last all that long. But really, the way to see this is that the Republican Party was very diverse. It was not vehemently opposed to the administrative state. Conservatives were, but the party as a whole wasn't. And there were people like William F. Buckley railing from the sides, trying to marshal the troops and get people to see that this was a move toward totalitarianism and was, taking Americans to the slaughter, basically, and we needed to rise up and do something about it and stop big government. Okay, so this changed in the 1970s when conservatives actually began to gain real power. And, people became sort of less supportive of government, less supportive of taxes, less supportive of spending. Conservatives took advantage of that, and it looked to them like they might actually be able to win the presidency in 1976, but 1980, right? And so conservatives looked around and they said, okay, how can we wage war on this administrative state? And the answer that they drew was sort of a shocking one for conservatives. They decided that, hey, Congress is basically controlled by Democrats. It's not going to do anything. They're the ones who built this administrative state. The courts are not going to do anything because the courts are centered around a jurisprudence that has accommodated the administrative state, said that it's okay, that it's constitutional. The presidency became their major hope. And what they then had as their epiphany was that if they could just get a presidency with extraordinary power, a conservative president with extraordinary power, that president could take on the bureaucracy, the administrative state, unilaterally and control it and subvert it from above. And so conservatives then increasingly began supporting a move toward a presidency of extraordinary power. In the past, the conservatives had always favored like minimal authority for the president, minimal government, and they always railed against FDR and Wilson and others and called them totalitarians because they were strong presidents. And what they wanted was some kind of congressional government that didn't do much. Well, now they were favoring a presidency of extraordinary power and thinking that they could use that president to attack the government from above and undermine it through his own unilateral power. So this was a presidency that would exercise extraordinary power through unilateral power, not through new legislation. Okay, so the next step was Ronald Reagan got elected. And during the Reagan years, the Reagan people developed what's now known as the Unitary Executive Theory. And what the Unitary Executive Theory is, it's at the time, a new theory of constitutional jurisprudence that claims that if you really understand the Constitution, it gives the presidents vast, expansive, unilateral power. And it gives him total control over the executive branch, who gets fired, who gets hired, and everything that people can say and do within the executive branch. He controls everything. And that Congress and the courts, which had traditionally imposed all sorts of constraints on what presidents can do within the executive branch, Congress and the courts needed to stay out. In fact, it was constitutionally illegitimate for them to encroach on the president's turf. This was the president's turf, the executive branch. It was his. And so Congress couldn't, say, create an independent agency whose officials were more difficult to fire because they had fixed staggered terms. According to the Unitary Executive, presidents should be able to fire anybody in the executive branch that they didn't like. And it didn't have to be a firing for cause because the person couldn't do their job. It was just a firing because presidents didn't like them, didn't like their ideology, didn't think they were loyal enough. Out they go. Right? So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, the Unitary Executive was in its infancy during the Reagan years, but this was the first major move to legally justify a presidency of extraordinary power. And this was a conservative operation, right, within the Reagan administration. Okay, so over time, this theory caught on among conservative legal scholars who strengthened it over the years, and it caught on and was used by Republican presidential administrations over the years. And those administrations increasingly put that theory to stronger and stronger use, making more and more extreme claims for what presidents have a right to do, to the point that it has provided the legal basis for Trump's strongman presidency, where Trump says, I have an Article 2, and it says I can do whatever I want. That's the Unitary Executive in a nutshell. The president unconstrained in exercising unilateral action and running this country. Okay, so one more thing has to do with the incentives that Republicans had to do this. So during, beginning in the 1960s, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Southern white conservatives began to move away from the Democratic Party, which had passed those major civil rights laws. And these whites in the South moved toward the Republican Party. And the South, which had always been controlled by Democrats and solidly Democratic, ultimately became solidly Republican. This took decades to happen, but it did happen. As part of that, there was a backlash against the progressive policies of the federal government, right? Its policies on race and on gender, right? And on minorities in general, the rights of minorities, and on religion. So this was a cultural conservatism that really came together in the South and provided a basis for huge grievances against a progressive federal government that, in their view, was imposing all of these unwanted views on them, on this conservative culture. Now, that's one part of this, of the change that was occurring. The other change that was occurring came about starting in about the 1990s with these huge worldwide forces of globalization, technological change, immigration, social diversity, that imposed all kinds of major changes, sort of swept across these countries, not just the United States, but here in the United States, the result of it was that lots of lower and lower middle class workers, blue collar workers, lost their jobs to workers overseas. Manufacturers had to shut down, many of them located in rural communities. Rural communities became decimated. And so there were massive economic consequences that sort of destroyed the economic foundations and the economic security of these constituencies of people, right? giving them a basis for serious grievance against the federal government that, in their view, sat by while globalization and all the rest ravaged them. They wanted a government that would stop that would stand up for them, and it didn't do that. And so that was another basis of this anti-system sentiment. And as part of this thing that was happening with globalization, et cetera, there was a cultural component, because it also involved massive immigration into this country, and many people, especially in rural areas, became convinced that immigrants were coming in, they were taking jobs that should belong to blue-collar whites, and they were also threatening the sort of the traditional white Christian culture of the country. And so, in their view, this was a very, very serious threat to their way of life. And so it was like grievance piled on grievance, and all of these grievances gave way to, or gave impetus to, a populist movement in this country. And that populist movement grew and grew and grew. And that movement was and remains fervently anti-system. Right? This is a system that has failed them. Our system is a democratic system. Democracy has failed them. And what they want, and what progressives actually around the world, populists around the world want, is a strongman who will stand above the usual democratic system, do away with all its cumbersome procedures and laws that just get in the way, and act unilaterally, right, to vent their grievances and do something about them by attacking this decrepit system that they hate and bringing that system down. Okay, so I'll just sort of wrap this up here. Those forces took decades to work themselves out. There were people during the 1990s, Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, Pat Buchanan, that were pioneers in marshaling the populist troops and growing the movement, but it was still too small and too weak to win elections. And it wasn't until the Tea Party and also the election of our first black president, Barack Obama, that populism really sort of was launched in a way that was truly consequential. And Donald Trump saw this, and, you know, up until that time, Donald Trump he was a political neophyte. He didn't even know if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He didn't have any fixed beliefs. And he could see that something big was brewing. This was a tiger, and he could ride that tiger all the way to the White House. And so he began to craft himself as a populist leader. He wasn't that beforehand. He became that because this was his path to power. He could have become almost anything to try to do that. This is what he saw as his ticket to success, and he was right. Right? And the first thing he did to become a populist favorite was to lead the birther movement, claiming that Obama was born in Kenya and was illegitimate as an American president. Well, that was a complete lie. And it's very clear to any thinking American that it was a lie. And more than likely, Trump knew it was a lie, because it was. But he led that movement. He became very popular among populists for doing that. It got him in the news. And he just kept at it. And in the race for the presidency on the Republican side in 2015 and then 16, Trump was the only one who looked around and saw that this populist constituency was strong enough to propel him to the White House. And so that's how he became the populist strongman. He was the one. As he put it, only I can fix it. I'm your strongman. All the others weren't. There were 16 other candidates. I didn't say that. Trump said that. So he became the populist guy. And he rode populism to the White House. And the rest is history. You know, he became a strong man, and all that goes along with that, because that was his ticket to power. And why did he become a strong man? Because the underlying forces were there that provided him with the political power to gain office and to exercise that power. So, anyway, that's sort of the long version. There's a lot more to it, but actually it's not all that complicated. You know, what it comes down to is these basic fundamentals, and how those fundamentals propelled Republican presidents, and especially Donald Trump, along a certain path, and that path was a presidency of extraordinary power, and ultimately a strongman presidency. And we'll talk eventually, I'm sure, about how the Democrats were not on that path.
Yeah,
Democratic presidents don't do this. Republican presidents do.
Yeah, this is very helpful. It's very helpful to understand how, I guess, all the different threats, both the history in terms of presidential power, but also how these different forces coalesced into, I guess, what I'm going to call populist conservatism, of this
Yes.
kind of mix of a strongman presidency with all these other opinions and beliefs and policies and stuff like this. And I do like your interpretation that Trump basically took advantage of that, and a bit of an opportunistic interpretation of Trump. And I think even if someone wants to say, no, Trump really believes in that, if that's their interpretation, then I would say, well, then he became a candidate because of these threads. Like, there could be people who said that, but in a different era, they just wouldn't become a candidate.